When we think about how Caesar won the great Roman Civil War, one battle usually comes to mind. It's that huge showdown in Greece, right? The Battle of Pharsalus. Caesar's army smashes Pompey the Great's forces, and, well, that's the end of the story. But what if I told you that epic battle wasn't the end? Not even close. It was really just the end of the beginning.
And look, it's true, in 48 BC, at Pharsalus, Caesar pulled off a spectacular victory. Pompey, the so-called defender of the Republic, was totally beaten and had to flee for his life. You can just imagine the news hitting Rome. Everyone probably breathed a sigh of relief, thinking the war that tore their world apart was finally done.
But of course, it's never that simple, is it? We tend to think Pompey's defeat, and his rather grisly end in Egypt, well, that was case closed. Caesar becomes the undisputed master of Rome. But that tidy little version of history just skips right over 3 more years of absolutely brutal, desperate fighting that almost cost Caesar everything.
Yeah, not even close. Pharsalus was just Act 1. To actually win this thing, Caesar still had to fight his way out of a deadly trap in Alexandria. Then he had to turn around and face a reborn enemy army in Africa that was, get this, even bigger than Pompey's. And after all that, there was still one last incredibly bloody campaign in Spain against Pompey's own sons.
So it all kicks off in Egypt. Caesar follows Pompey there, probably thinking he's just going to do a little political cleanup. Instead, he sails right into a 9-month-long nightmare.
And the situation he walks into, it is just insane. Look at these numbers. Caesar shows up with this tiny force, just over 4,000 guys, and he immediately gets sucked into this local power struggle between Cleopatra and her brother. And before he knows it, he's completely trapped in the royal palace, surrounded by an army of over 20,000 Egyptian regulars who know that city like the back of their hand.
And this wasn't some quick fight. We're talking 9 long, grueling months. He's forced into these incredibly desperate moves, like burning the entire Egyptian fleet in the harbor just to stop them from cutting him off from the sea. At one point, things go so wrong that he has to literally jump off a bridge and swim for his life, holding his shield with one arm and trying to keep his important papers out of the water with the other. It's only because a relief army shows up at the last possible second that he's saved at the Battle of the Nile.
Even ancient historians like Plutarch looked at this whole mess and thought it was a massive, unforced error. He called it, and I quote, "not necessary, inglorious, and full of peril." And while Caesar was stuck in Egypt, playing politics with Cleopatra, his real enemies were regrouping, and they were building something truly dangerous.
And that brings us to Africa. This is where the real threat was building. The Optimates, that's Pompey's allies in the Senate, they were far from done. In fact, they'd raised a whole new army that was arguably even more dangerous than the one Caesar beat at Pharsalus.
And this wasn't just some ragtag bunch of survivors, okay? We're talking serious A-list leadership. You've got Metellus Scipio in command, the hardcore Republican ideologue Cato the Younger providing the moral backbone, and worst of all for Caesar, his old second-in-command, the brilliant cavalry general Titus Labienus, had switched sides. Together with their ally King Juba, they put together this colossal force, 14 legions, thousands of cavalry, and 120 war elephants. A real monster of an army. So what does Caesar land in Africa with after his fleet gets scattered in a storm? 3,000 men. Just 3,000. He was in a terrifyingly bad spot, facing a potential army of nearly 90,000 with just a handful of his guys.
And right away, his old friend Labienus springs this brilliant trap at Raspina. He uses this ingenious tactic, hiding his infantrymen among his cavalry so Caesar can't tell how many troops he has, and then he just completely surrounds Caesar's small force. For hours, Caesar's men are just stuck in this tight circle, getting hammered with javelins from all sides. They were on the verge of being completely wiped out.
Somehow, Caesar's veterans managed to fight their way out, but man, what a close call. The campaign just drags on until the final battle at Thapsus, and it's here that the Optimate commander, Scipio, makes a catastrophic mistake. He decides to draw up his army for battle while a big chunk of his men are still disorganized and tired from building their camp.
Caesar's men, they just sense the weakness and they charge without even waiting for orders. The result is a total slaughter, and the aftermath for the enemy leaders is just grim. As you can see, all the key players, Scipio, Cato, Juba, Patricius, they all chose suicide over being captured by Caesar. For them, death was better than living in a world ruled by one man. It was the ultimate defiant statement that for them, the Republic was truly dead.
So, 2 massive armies destroyed, the leadership all dead. Surely now the war was over. Nope. There was one last pocket of resistance left, which led to the final and maybe the most brutal chapter of the whole war. Spain. And this time it was personal. Caesar was up against Pompey's own sons, Gnaeus and Sextus.
And Caesar himself tells us just how close this one was. This quote, which he reportedly said after the Battle of Munda, it just says everything. "I had often fought for victory, but on this occasion, I fought for my life." I mean, coming from a guy who had spent decades fighting basically everyone, that is a truly chilling thing to say. And that's because the Battle of Munda wasn't about clever tactics or brilliant maneuvers. It was just a pure, ugly, grinding slog. The Pompeians had the high ground, a really strong position on a hill, and Caesar's men had to charge straight up into them. For hours, the battle lines just crashed into each other in this brutal, hand-to-hand fight, and neither side could get an advantage.
The fighting was so bad, so desperate, that Caesar himself had to grab a shield and run to the front line to stop his men from breaking. When the Pompeian line finally did crack, the chase that followed was a complete massacre. The cost was just staggering. 30,000 of the enemy were killed, including Caesar's old general Labienus, for the loss of about 1,000 of his own guys. This, right here, was the true, bloody end of the Civil War.
So, after almost 5 years of non-stop war, after fighting and winning on 3 different continents, after he had already defeated Pompey, Caesar finally came back to Rome. The wars were over, but the price of that total victory was the Republic itself.
The Senate, which by now was packed with his supporters, just showered him with honors. But the most important one was this. He was made dictator not for the usual 6-month emergency term, but for 10 years. This was completely unprecedented. It basically concentrated all the power of the state into one man's hands. He was a king in everything but name.
So Caesar had finally won. He stood completely alone, the absolute master of the entire Roman world. But in that relentless, bloody pursuit of total victory, he had completely shattered the very system he claimed he was fighting to save. And that leaves us with one final, haunting question. With all his enemies finally gone, who was left to save Rome from Caesar himself?